Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into something really fascinating. We are impartially unpacking some brand new research that, honestly, totally flips the script on what we thought we knew about cattle and climate change. Now, for years, you've probably heard the same aggregate statistics pointing to cows as this massive driver of global warming. But today, we're digging into a fresh collection of agricultural data, historical context, and biological science that proposes a radically different perspective. We're going to explore what the research actually says about cattle being a net benefit to our environment when they're managed correctly. So let's jump right in and ask the big question that is literally at the center of the modern agricultural debate. Are cows actually the climate problem, or are they part of the solution? Now, keeping in mind that we're strictly following the data here, data provided by agricultural researchers, climate scientists, and farm analysts, we're going to break down the exact mechanisms of how cattle interact with our soil and our atmosphere.
What's really wild about this is this bold statement from researchers over at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. They found that when optimized grazing is applied, specifically tailored to the climate and the region, there is actually more carbon sequestered into the ground than what cattle breathe out in CO2 and produce in methane. Think about that for a second. This suggests cattle might actually act as biological engines, actively recharging the Earth's carbon battery instead of just draining it.
To understand how this is even possible, here's our agenda. First, we'll look at the cattle climate debate. Second, the biogenic carbon cycle. Third, cattle as protein upcyclers. Fourth, the advent of green cattle. Fifth, we'll look at the Boran, which is a climate-proof breed. And finally, we'll wrap up with a sustainable farming future.
All right, let's get right into section 1, the cattle climate debate.
When we actually look at the data, a much more nuanced picture emerges than what we usually see on the news. While the prevailing narrative over the last few decades has been that cattle are just inherently destructive polluters, multiple sources are now indicating that stable cattle populations are actually carbon neutral within natural cycles. The argument from these researchers is that every cow only adds net new carbon to the atmosphere if the total number of cows is increasing. If the population is stable, well, the carbon they emit is simply part of a continuous, regenerative loop that's been spinning for thousands of years.
Which brings us perfectly to section 2, the biogenic carbon cycle.
This biological mechanism right here explains exactly how carbon moves from the grass into the cow, up into the atmosphere, and back again. And it brilliantly illustrates a massive stark contrast in timescales. You see, methane from cattle is biogenic. It breaks down in the atmosphere in just 10 to 12 years, converting back into CO2. And guess what? That is the exact same CO2 the grass needs to absorb to grow the following year. It's a closed 12-year recycling loop. Compare that to fossil fuel emissions, which pull up ancient carbon from deep underground. That CO2 accumulates and just sits in our atmosphere for roughly 1,000 years. The sources argue that treating a 12-year natural cycle the exact same way as a 1,000-year industrial accumulation, well, it's a fundamental flaw in how we currently calculate livestock emissions.
But wait, it gets better. It's not just about what goes into the air, it's about what goes into the ground. Data from the University of Nebraska shows that cattle actually push carbon deep into the earth. When you look at surface soil after 4 years, up to 25% of the carbon from raw manure and an incredible 36% of carbon from composted manure remains locked away, sequestered in the soil. Chemical fertilizers absolutely do not do this. Only organic matter from animals actively rebuilds the physical structure and the carbon content of degraded soils. It's like a natural healing process. Okay, moving right along to section 3, cattle as protein upcyclers. Now, the crucial point I want you to focus on here is this number, 1.96. This is the net protein contribution, or NPC score, of typical Australian grain-finished beef. So what does that actually mean for us? It means cattle create nearly twice as much human edible protein as they consume. And keep in mind, this is for cattle that spend at least some time in feedlots. For strictly grass-fed cattle, the researchers noted their contribution is literally off the charts. We're talking about producing an astounding 1,600 times the human edible protein that they consume. 1,600 times.
To really grasp why that NPC score is such a game changer, we have to look at what they're eating. Humans just can't digest cellulose. We can't go out and eat coarse grass or the leftover byproducts from the agricultural industry. So instead of competing with humans for food on prime arable farmland, cattle are utilizing marginal, unfarmable land. Their 4-chambered stomachs are like biological magic, transforming completely indigestible plant matter into highly bioavailable, high-quality amino acids that humans actually need to thrive. They aren't the problem, they are the ultimate biological recycling plants. This perfectly sets up section 4, the advent of green cattle.
Researchers over at the University of Bristol and Rothamsted Research are taking this whole concept a step further. You see, traditional carbon footprinting usually just looks at a whole farm's aggregate data, but this new research method, it isolates individual cows. And by doing this, they've identified what they're calling green cattle. These are individual animals right there within a herd that naturally require fewer resources, grow much more efficiently, and produce significantly lower emissions per kilogram of live weight gain. So by identifying these specific genetics, farmers can actively select for highly efficient, low-impact herds. It proves that we can totally optimize ruminants for sustainability.
Let's look at a real-world example of this in Section 5. Boran, the climate-proof breed.
According to some really extensive data gathered by Intellect, they're an agricultural consulting group that benchmarks farm performance down in South Africa, the Boran breed is proving to be an absolute powerhouse of efficiency when measuring things like operating profit and return on assets across all types of farming systems. Intensive, semi-intensive, extensive, Boran cattle consistently rank among the absolute most profitable and environmentally efficient farming operations out there.
So why are they so incredibly successful? Well, it's because they are virtually climate-proof. They've been shaped by centuries of intense natural selection in Kenya and Ethiopia. So Boran cattle don't just survive, they thrive in harsh environments where modern, high-input European breeds would just completely fail. Their light coats actually reflect the sun. They have loose skin and active sweat glands that give them extreme heat tolerance. That means they keep grazing when other cows overheat and just stop eating. They naturally resist ticks and tropical diseases, and crucially, they can maintain their body weight and their fertility even during severe droughts, all while eating coarse, super low-nutrient grass. And the financial side of this, it's truly staggering. Look at these numbers from the Intellect data. Because of this deep natural resilience, Boran operations spend only a fifth of what other farmers spend on veterinary care and medicine. A fifth! They spend less than 10% on self-produced feed, and they use 35% less diesel and fuel. They don't need massive chemical inputs, they don't need heavy shelter, and they don't need constant medical intervention. They are the literal definition of low-input, high-yield agriculture.
Let's tie it all up in Section 6, a sustainable farming future.
Okay, let's bring all of this together to picture what the future of sustainable, truly climate-resilient farming actually looks like based on these sources. There's this great dialogue from our source material on pasture management that highlights a massive blind spot in current environmental activism. While planting trees is super popular, and hey, trees are great, a farmer points out my soil carbon has been accumulating for 8,000 years. Think about that. Trees store carbon above ground, right, where it's super vulnerable to forest fires, disease, or logging. But the data suggests that maintaining well-grazed grasslands, specifically with low-input breeds, is actually one of the most stable, fire-resistant methods of deep, below-ground carbon storage we have on the entire planet.
So it leaves us with a pretty fascinating paradigm shift to think about. If perfectly adapted, low-input cattle like the Boran can actively rebuild our topsoil, if they can upcycle indigestible waste into vital human protein, and if they naturally resist extreme heat and drought without heavy industrial inputs, isn't it time we look at the data, move past the aggregate statistics, and view these animals not as the ultimate climate problem, but as our most powerful, totally overlooked biological solution? Thanks for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning the consensus, and keep following the data.